Hello friends. Another important section is the render, output part in the camera tab. Friends, this is the part where we will get the render output. Normally, many users not only render a single frame with the aim of explaining the entire area to the user. They take a single frame. However, we actually need to divide the scenes we render into multiple sections. These vary, for example, showing a general scene, or the area where the TV section is, or the area where the dining section is. However, the 16:9 widescreen image you have taken may not save you everywhere. So, when I take a 16:9 render from here, unless I render in a square or rectangular shape, the widescreen part will not save the screen I rendered, my friends. Therefore, I need to make a different render setting here. So, either I'm trying to show something vertical in a horizontal way. I want to show these vertical parts here, but I'm taking a render in a horizontal format. This actually shows that the technique is wrong for me. Here, I can select the widescreen part and take it in a square format, or by altering the ratio to 5:4 or 4:5. When I select 4:5, friends, look, due to the extension of the screen in this way, we can adjust our lens by pressing the lens icon here. See, it says 95 degrees. By writing 40 instead of 95 degrees, I get a bit closer. Look, normally in 4:5, meaning in an 8.1 ratio, it will render in this area here. I can extend this area and take a render like this. This falls into the category of more artistic, what we call artistic renders. These are important, friends. When I render this way, I only capture this part, and it doesn't show the other parts. When I select 1:1 from here, the screen will expand a bit more, and I will capture this area in full screen, friends. When I render this way, I can take a render that shows only the dining section without displaying the parts left outside proportionally, friends. On the screen, there's a slight Before we make our adjustments, we have color correction and different settings. I will show them, friends. If we first adjust these screen parts, we can continue without issues in the other parts. But the camera section, the camera tab, is really an important tab, friends. Also, it is beneficial to pay attention to the environmental elements around to enhance the ambience. Eye-catching, interesting portraits. In a living room, for example, we can create different objects like a robot, perform different operations. Friends, these are important. Look, we took these operations in close-up render. Towards the end of our lessons, I will publish a few lessons called V-Ray tips, along with V-Ray friends, both for making the settings quickly and for gaining practicality in some aspects. I will show them. For now, let's continue by taking this render here, friends. Let's see what kind of result will emerge. Yes, the rendering is continuing, friends. Let's check the denoiser here to produce a smoother render. Of course, in normal renders, we will continue by increasing the settings a bit more, friends. Look, we have a section like this here. We can significantly reduce the highlight burn here. If you want, you can increase it so that the effect outside is a bit less. If you want it to explode a bit more, this is the process, friends. We can also play with other parts. The settings we last made are evident here. Look, I can increase the light a bit more here like this, or I can decrease it, adjust its toning, or you can adjust the texture settings here, or in different ways. Here, there was a color correction section. Look, there is a color balance section and a hue saturation section. For example, when you come to the color balance section, you can play with the parts here, friends. Look, it says cyan and red here. You can change the color variables. However, there is something like this here, friends. While making adjustments, some users increase these values in very decimal numbers. But the millimetric changes we make here cause an incredible image. Therefore, making small adjustments like this will be more beneficial. For example, if there is a slight yellowish tint, to counteract it, when you increase the yellow and blue section, with the right side being blue and the left side being yellow, the effect here will change. Look, I have slightly reduced that effect. There was a slight yellowish effect, and I have reduced it. This is the process, friends. 0.058. Look, this is like that too. This also has an effect like 0.097. For the rest, once you mark them, you will achieve beautiful results like this. Of course, the area you want to explain is very important. There is also this situation. I call this a stop, friends. In this section, you need to select the two viewpoint perspective option in the camera section so that your camera is fully vertical, friends. Look, when I select this, the camera becomes perfectly vertical. If you want, you can look from a bit higher up. After making the adjustments this way, it's enough to right-click on this part and press the update button. Once you do that, your scene will be saved in this way, friends. Now, here's the situation. In the extension section, save this, friends. When you enter the V-Ray section in the tools part, the object. Here there's a batch render. In the rendering section, friends, there's a batch render part. If you click on the batch render section, it will take and save the scenes you have set up here, such as scene 1, scene 2, scene 5, 6, 3, and 4 in order. But before that, you need to specify the location, where your file path is saved in the Save Image section here. For example, if you save it as PNG in the V-Ray living room section, when you click on the batch render section, it will save all of these in order. Of course, before that, make sure your settings are set to CUDA here, and that your processor and graphics card are selected, and also ensure that you have reached the high plus settings in the final settings. By making the final settings in the high plus settings, it will provide you with the highest quality. Then you can continue by making the settings here, friends. Of course, the processor and graphics card are of great importance for render time in V-Ray. Your processor and graphics card need to be efficient. They need to be good, friends. If render times continue to take too long, you may ask, why is it taking me so long? Don't ask, well, render times in V-Ray normally take a long time, friends. So, rendering a scene like this in 4K resolution would take about an hour to an hour and a half on a good computer. On laptops, you can find render times reaching 2, 3, or even 4 hours for a single frame. That's why render times in V-Ray are a bit longer, friends. But the resulting output is quite satisfying. For example, when I go back to scene 1, if I render like this, I will only see this part. But I need to specify the area I want to show to the user in the scene. Like this, I come over here, and like this, for example, let's say I want to show this part with the table, meaning the part where the glass and the table are. But look, half of the table is left outside. I need to show the area. I want to display Matuche on the clear screen between these two black lines. Friends, look, I can show it like this, or even increase this area a bit more to show the couches. When I go to the settings section, when I select the 5x4 here, you'll see that the area has expanded a bit more, friends. When I zoom out a bit more with the lens, when I come back like this, I might have adjusted the area. When I set the camera to 2 viewpoint, it will perform an operation like this. In fact, later on, there's the depth of field technique here, friends. I will show that later. When you activate the depth of field technique here, the other parts of the area you marked will become blurred, allowing you to move towards a more artistic rendering. But I won't show that now. Rendering takes a very long time, friends. What you need to do here is to go to the high plus settings at the final stage. Or, if you want the process to be faster, it's beneficial to go to the high settings and increase the resolution here. Friends, after increasing it and waiting for a certain period for rendering, you need to open the denoiser section here for the resulting output. Then you need to press the diskette icon here to save it, friends. As you can see, it saves this as a PNG here. The result that appears when saved will be the same as the result you see here. Sometimes, due to color tones, that is, because of the color calibration used by the monitor or the color palette used by V-Ray, the render result here may differ from the render result you saved. Don't be surprised by that, friends. You can adjust the colors of the resulting output again in Photoshop. Sometimes the results can come out differently, so don't be surprised about that at all, because the color palette used by V-Ray and the color palette or the color codes used by Windows are somewhat different, let's say. There is a mismatch, a difference coming from there, friends. Sometimes such situations can occur, or when you see it here and send it to someone else. Via WhatsApp or different social media, the tones may appear different. That is normal. There is absolutely nothing unusual, friends. Don't be too surprised by it. We inform the user about such situations from the beginning, because In the renders you have taken, the color calibration of your monitor will be somewhat different from the color calibration of others. For those working at a professional level, there are color calibration devices, and color calibration is done with them. Friends, I won't delve too much into that topic because they are both expensive devices and necessary for matching colors in printing, but they are not needed for us at the moment. You can bring them to a somewhat similar level in Photoshop. Right now, we are trying to achieve the highest quality result for a quality and realistic render in the shortest time possible. Because in render engines, V-Ray is now considered among the long-duration render engines, we need to set up the scene quickly and go directly to the result. But there's something I always say. While setting up the scene, work extensively on ambiance elements like color tones, quality materials, quality shading, and quality models, and then bring them into the final scene. You see the initial part of the scene and its final state, friends? Preparing the model and bringing them into harmony is a very different thing. That's why you need to work extensively on the scene. You need to research what is where, which color tones are suitable, contrast ratio, light ratios, which light should I use, what should I use. Actually, the things you will use and do are very simple. In our next lessons, I will explain by giving a general summary of the parts we have already done, friends. The other parts are already about using textures, assigning textures, and adjusting the lights and ambience inside. But in the next lesson, which is a summary of everything, I will explain the summary of all of them, friends. That's all for this lesson. See you in our next lesson. Goodbye, with love and respect.